introduce you soon. I also wanted to make sure that clicker's there.
Okay. Check this.
That's there. Yeah, we're good.
Just gonna leave this up here. You good?
I love it. That's old school. Yeah, you can leave it up there.
Hopefully the slide will stay there. My name is Karen de Bruin, and I am the director of the honors program. And I'd just like to welcome you all to the 61st Honors Colloquium entitled Democracy in Peril. Just a few housekeeping details. As you may have noticed, the emergency exits are in the rear and also on the sides of the stage. The bathrooms are in the foyer. And please, no photos or video recordings. Please also silence your phones and also put them away. We like to give our undivided attention to the speaker, and also your screens are a little distracting when you're standing out looking at all the lights off. So if you need to leave during the event, I see that the doors are actually open. Maybe that's just to keep the breeze coming through. But please leave quietly. If the doors do close, just close them quietly behind you because they do make noise. So I would like to welcome Sonia Silvermoon Thomas, a first-year URI student of theater, and also a Narragansett tribal member, to do the land acknowledgement. And I'm actually going to read the land acknowledgement to her, and then she's going to say a few words. So please welcome Sonia Silvermoon Thomas to the stage. So the University of Rhode Island occupies the traditional stomping ground of the Narragansett Nation and the Niantic people. We honor and respect the enduring and continuing relationship between the indigenous people and this land by teaching and learning more about their history and present-day communities, and by becoming the stewards of the land we too inhabit. Sonia is going to say a few words for us. Thank you, Sonia.
Oh, jeez. Can you hear me? Awesome. Akwani, everyone. I am Sonia Thomas, my native name being Wamponiment, meaning full moon. Now, traditionally, a sachem could either be born into the position or elected to it. In either circumstance, they only retained the position by proving themselves worthy of the post. A leader was accountable to the community they served, and they did not lead alone. They took counsel from other community leaders and elders, discussion, debate, consensus, compromise, a government led by the will of the people. Those same ideals are true to the American democracy, and yet we see evidence that the system of democracy is in peril. The support of the people is vital to a healthy democracy. One cannot lead alone. There is an African proverb that states, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. For this country to continue in progress, we need each other. That includes the indigenous people who have governed these lands for generations. You all are seated in the ancestral lands of the Narragansett, my ancestors. Our leaders fought for our continuance, despite conquest and colonization. Their success was not of their own making, but the success of a people working together for survival. That work continues, but we cannot do it alone. We need the support of the community around us. A land acknowledgement is meant to bring attention to the need for action. As you sit today and bring light to democracy in peril, please consider how that democracy represents all the people. Support Indigenous continuity. Support Indigenous sovereignty. Tabatni, thank you.
That was beautiful. Thank you very much. In the spirit of if you want to go fast, go alone, and if you want to go far, go together, The mission of the Honors Colloquium is to foster campus-wide and community-wide discussion on pressing issues of our time. And in the spirit of this campus-wide and community-wide discussion, we are thrilled to promote our partner events on this slide. All goes well. There we go. And I'd just like to say just a few quick words about them. The Sustaining Democracy Center for the Humanities lecture series, there is a big event coming up on October 3rd at 4 p.m. It's Javier Zamora, a poet and memoirist who explores his own harrowing journey to the U.S. as an accompanied 9-year-old and the realities of child migration. The URI Theater, the play Mackinac is going to be opening on October 10th. Our art showcase just went live. Some of you may have seen it, but and if you haven't, check out our social media channels. Asia's been doing some awesome posting about it. We have, I think, over 70 works that are up on the 3rd and 4th floor of Lippitt Hall that are around the theme of the politics of personality. These are professional artists that have done these works, and it's the Department of Art and Art History that's sponsoring this event. We have a 12-foot Fidel Castro. You have to check him out. The Hera Gallery, if you haven't already filled out your card that what does democracy mean to you in 10 words or less, please do that. That's going to be the backdrop of their exhibit. We've already had hundreds of these cards filled out, but we would love to include you also. And that opening is on October 12th, when you'll be able to see all of what the community members have written about democracy. Finally, our Rise Up Challenge students, there's money involved. Sometimes there's funding for your projects. It's the theme this year is democratic innovation, or democratizing innovation, maybe. Go back to the back table where you will see Sharday Johnson and Cynthia Taylor, who can answer any of your questions. Again, the prize, there's prize money involved, and it can make a big difference to your projects that you're thinking about. They can even launch these projects, so it's exciting. Producing a series of this scope requires 1 to 2 years of planning and many campus partners. Thanks especially to our Colloquium coordinators. I'll just say their names and you can raise your hands. It's a little hard to see everybody with the lights out, but Mark Hutchison, who's not here tonight because he's out sick, but Ashley Rundlet, who you'll see in just a second, Brian Kruger, who you'll also see during the, or maybe you won't because I'm not sure about the question and answer, but he's here. Beth Mendenhall and Rick McIntyre from the College of Arts and Sciences. Thanks to all the sponsors that you can find also on our program. We couldn't do this without all of our sponsors. And a special thanks to the president and his office and the provost and her office for their sustaining sponsorship of this URI Honors Colloquium. Please consider supporting the honors program. Beyond this wonderful colloquium, it also supports our education initiatives. And finally, join us next week for José Chebab, who will be our next speaker. And now, to present some very exciting news and also introduce our speaker, please welcome Ashley Rundlet, one of the organizers of this year's colloquium and professor of political science.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our next installment of our Democracy in Peril Colloquium series. My name is Ashley Rundlet, one of the colloquium organizers and an assistant professor in the political science department here at URI. So we first want to start off with an announcement. We're thrilled to announce our partnership event with the James Langevin Symposium. Congressman Adam Kinzinger will be the keynote speaker. And this event was made possible through the support of the URI John Hazen White Senior Center for Ethics and Public Service, the College of Arts and Sciences, the Office of the President, and the URI Honors Program. Congressman Kinzinger will speak on Tuesday, October 15th at 5 p.m. here in Edwards Hall, and while free and open to the public, this will be a ticketed event. So details for registration can be found on the Colloquium website, or you can use that QR code right up there. And we do encourage you all to please register sooner rather than later, so seats are going. So, before we begin, I want to acknowledge that today's discussion will address sensitive topics related to race, including issues and languages that may be uncomfortable or distressing, especially to our students, our faculty, and our community members of color. While these conversations are important for understanding the challenges our democracy faces, they can also evoke strong reactions. If at any point you feel overwhelmed, please feel free to step out and rejoin the conversation when you're ready. Our goal is to foster an open, respectful, and supportive environment for this important discussion. With that said, before I introduce our speaker, one of the recurring themes in our series is the role that race and racial hierarchies play in fueling democratic instability. Zach Beecham explored how democratic backsliding is often driven by reactionary forces resisting social equality, while Daniel Ziblatt illustrated how racial dynamics, especially the backlash of white voters in response to civil rights reforms, have reshaped political extremism in the US. Ziblatt compared this contemporary backlash to the post-Reconstruction South, where Southern Democrats violently resisted multiracial democracy. And he posited that existential fears about demographic change are radicalizing a segment of the electorate today. Building on these discussions, we wanted to invite a scholar whose work centers around these issues, someone who can help us further understand how race continues to shape democratic vulnerability. That's why we're honored to have Dr. Andrew Ifedapo Thompson with us today. Andrew Ifedapo Thompson is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. His research focuses on understanding the political implications of racial demographic shifts in the US and how these changes influence political extremism, democratic backsliding, and political violence. His recent work explores the dynamics of group threat perceptions, elite and mass racial messaging, and the emotional reactions to perceived demographic changes. He previously held prestigious fellowships at MIT and Notre Dame, and his research has been recognized through numerous grants and awards. After Andrew's talk, we will invite up Dr. Karen Sweeting, one of my colleagues and assistant professor of political science here at URI, for a continuing discussion about his talk. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Andrew Ifedapo Thompson.
Hey everyone, is this on? Are we good? Okay. Oh no. Okay. First of all, I just want to say thank you to all of you for attending. Thank you to URI. Thank you to the students who I had just a lengthy conversation with earlier. It was incredibly enlivening. I'm really grateful for y'all for taking the time. I'm grateful for each and every one of you for being here. Seriously, I mean, we're what, 2 hours before the debate. I'm sure you had other, obligations or just, I don't know, pre-gaming the debate. I have no idea what you would do in anticipation of the debate, dreading what's to happen, things of that sort. But you're here with me and you're here with us, and I appreciate it. Okay, so let's just get started. So I'm going to be going, or just sort of describing a sort of at-length project that I've been involved in. The sort of first half of this talk will be effectively covering what is my first book, and then what kind of bridge into what will be sort of future-looking, both in the context of my work itself, but also the future of American multiracial democracy. So let's just get started. The title of my book is right here. Just always be plugging is like just have to constantly do it. I'm sorry. The Big Flip. Yes, this is the title. Racial Demographic Change and the Future of American Democracy. Okay. We'll start with an excerpt of my book. This is the first chapter. So, the Great Replacement. Yeah, it's not a conspiracy theory. It's their electoral strategy. And we know that because they say it all the time. This statement comes from Tucker Carlson, a political pundit on Fox News. Here, he is directly responding to a mass shooting in Buffalo, New York. The shooter had one clear motive: rebelling against a sense of threat they felt was coming from racial demographic change in the United States. And this is what follows. On May 15th, 2022, an 18-year-old entered a grocery store, Tops, with a modified Bushmaster XM15, an automatic gun similar to the AR-15. He live-streamed the entire shooting that would take place on Twitch. Pulling up in his car, he immediately shot and killed the security guard to the store. Then he shot 3 other people as he ran into the building through the front door. It initially looked to be an indiscriminate mass shooting. Everyone who he saw, he opened fire on. Running through the front of the store, he shot 4 other people multiple times. As a woman lay bleeding on the ground from multiple gunshot wounds, he aimed and shot her again. At this point, within the live stream, he reloaded the gun. Through his camera, viewers on his Twitch stream could read a few words that were written on the rifle. These were the words. These 4 words and the idea behind them are intimately connected. They call to the Great Replacement conspiracy theory. Near the end of the massacre, he pointed his gun at a person huddled behind a checkout counter. Realizing quickly that this person was white, he immediately aimed the gun away, exclaiming, "Sorry." In total, this man in Buffalo killed 10 people and injured another 3. Everyone who was killed in this mass shooting was a black American. This was his explicit murderous intent. He was motivated by ideas and messages about the Great Replacement conspiracy theory, like those described again next, as I'm about to go over, by Tucker Carlson. Here is what we do know as a fact, and I'm speaking as Tucker Carlson right now. There is a strong political component of the Democratic Party's immigration policy. We're not guessing this. We know this, and we know it because they have said so. They said it again and again and again. They've written books on it and monographs and magazine articles. They've bragged about it endlessly. They talk about it on cable news constantly, and they say it out loud. We are doing this because it helps us win elections. This is not something that is said once. It's something that is gloated about again and again and again, and we think that's wrong. So political elites, like Tucker Carlson, have been pushing narratives that the changes to the United States are deliberate, political, and a threat to the future of this country. The way that these acts are often interpreted silos the ideas of extremism into the terrorist who's committing the act among somewhat of a disparate amount of people in their sort of proximate circle. Lone wolves, as they're often described, individuals with mental health illnesses, on the whole, ideas that are basically isolated from moments from the sort of more general context of American society. What I have found within my work that extends from this book, as well as a series of other articles, and show empirically over the span of this recent work, is that these sentiments, racially threatened, violent, anti-democratic ones, are widely held across the American public. What I present next is a story about how racial threat emerges from these perceptions, namely of racial demographic change within this country, and how these ideas are directly driving and eroding ideas of American democracy. Okay, so what I just went over for you was the book, the excerpt. We're going to transition into what is effectively a summary of this, the remainder of the book. So what I refer to specifically within my book are perceptions about the sort of coming majority-minority flip. This is what is called the big flip. This is what I'm calling the big flip. What exactly do I mean by this? Well, I'll define it for you. The big flip, or the sort of majority-minority flip, as you may have come across before, is the projected date or moment wherein white Americans are expected to become a numerical minority and people of color, Americans of color, are projected to become a majority. And the important thing, as I'll consistently reiterate throughout this talk, is that the perceptions of what is to come within this country then generate a sense of threat among a specific subset of the public, and then ultimately drives these Americans away from supporting democracy as a system. So there's mass-level uncertainty, and this is a really crucial component of this, about what is to happen to American society within this sort of current moment and this projected near moment into the future. Let's be clear on this, though, and this is the thing I really want to be adamant about within this talk, because this can often get convoluted. So I'm prefacing this because I want you to retain this. We don't know how American society will change. That's just bare bones, sort of straight fact. It's a fact that we don't know. I'm sorry. There's a lot of moving parts within this. I'm talking about uncertainty particularly here. Prediction about political or social phenomena is a bunk practice. We barely know and have a sense of how weather is bound to change a few days out. I'm quite serious about this. I mean, I'm not going to get into a lengthier conversation about weather. But 5 days out, we cannot predict how the future of weather is to look. And so the major thing here, as it relates to the complexity of American society, is that predictions, projections, inferences about how the future is to change, how the future of politics are to change, are effectively coming from an irrational sort of place. Okay, regardless though of how, or even if we can predict those changes, which I just described to you as a bunk practice, the public still makes a series of inferences or assumptions about this uncertainty. So I'm not going to bury the lead here. These all sort of coalesce into a particular idea, which I've put up for you just now. I define this within the book as demographic determinism. This is a sort of like expectation about how the future is to change within the minds of, at this point, really millions of Americans. So what is this idea? It is as follows. The idea that as Americans of color increase in size and white Americans decrease, this is a projection, the Democratic Party is perceived to be at an increasing and eventually insurmountable advantage in the event of the big flip within electoral politics over the Republican Party. What I specifically do within the book is that I articulate that there are sort of 3 Ps that are motivating what is the central idea here of demographic determinism. I'll go over them really briefly for you to just give you a bit of a background. The first of which is prediction, people of color, which is what follows, the second P, and then partisanship. Prediction, specifically, is sort of built out of this uncertainty about how the future of the country is changing. And the major thing as it relates to racial demographic change, and really our presumptions about how things are to change, what I'm basically arguing, and I'm articulating both historically and empirically, is that race, built out of it being a social construct, is subject to change to contextual factors, societal factors. The immediate and great example of this is the idea of what is white. Whiteness has changed in the midst of the 20th century. Polish Americans, Italian Americans, Jewish Americans, Irish Americans were once deemed non-white, and then at some point later incorporated into, in the midst of the early 20th century, the idea of what is white. There's a book on this that I'm particularly referencing, How the Irish Became White. This is a sort of great historical overview of this particular idea. This then motivates what is the second P within this, which is people of color, and the set of inferences that Americans make about who people of color are, particularly. So what I find very consistently is that when Americans think of who people of color are, their minds go to black Americans. Their minds go both on a numerical level to this expectation that black Americans are significantly increasing within size, but also, which feeds into the third P, partisanship, they then make this same sort of inference or expectation that there will be more influence of these people of color, again, presuming or assuming that black Americans are increasing in size, but then also projecting similar levels of, in this case, attachment or connection to that of the Democratic Party, to other people of color, which is ultimately driving this final component on the level of partisanship, which is effectively here, this expectation that the Democratic Party is perceived to be at an increasing, and then, as I said, eventual insurmountable advantage within electoral politics. Okay, and so basically, within the midst of my study, my series of studies, I show that through variant levels of sort of prodding top of the mind assumptions, that this idea of demographic determinism has a causal, meaning that it sort of like directs or just connects immediately to senses of democracy, causal effect on support for democracy. Particularly, this shows up, it appears, and it basically manifests the strongest among Republicans. And the way that I articulate this, and I've gone over, we had an earlier conversation about this today as well, when thinking about the system of democracy, is that it makes some degree of sense that if in fact Republicans are to hold on to this idea of demographic determinism, that it would then erode their senses of support for democracy, particularly because of this zero-sum evaluation that they have of the system. So I'll just give you a sort of thought experiment. I'm going to take this off just for a moment. So just imagine a system, which I'm going to describe, this is basically democracy, wherein you need a majority to win, and there is effectively no other way to gain office, to maintain political power, and you perceive yourself to be a diminishing either majority or eventual minority. The question that sort of follows, we'll probably get into this in a little bit within the discussion at the conclusion of this, is how then do you react to the system itself? And what I'm arguing, and I demonstrate very consistently, is that this perception, misperception, uncertainty, drives what is a turning away from the very system of democracy in a variety of ways among Republicans specifically. Okay, so as I mentioned, and I'm just going to give a little bit of what is the sort of empirics surrounding the evidence surrounding this idea and this existence of demographic determinism out there within the public. I prod very, very lightly, as we would describe when it comes to priming. I activate ideas about how the country is changing. I'm basically asking over a series of, thousands of Americans in a variety of approaches, but namely this one that is effectively open-ended. What comes to mind when you think of racial demographic change within the country? So I'm asking, in this case, we read over today as well, a piece of mind that uses this, where we randomly assign this particular prime to Americans. And then following this, we both assess the extent to how they articulate themselves, but then also in a sort of closed-ended, quantitative approach, how this is affecting their anti-democratic or democratic support. So I'm not going to read these off for you, but these are some of the responses to this prompt. You may have heard of the diversification of the United States. Tell us what immediately comes to mind when you think of racial demographic change within the US. So this comes in 2023. This is an immediate response from an American just asked this particular question. America's browning, while it is not necessarily a bad thing, it may cause the slow extinction of the white race. While I disagree with eugenics, I understand why it was implemented in the past. This is eliciting what are effectively top-of-mind ideas about how the country is changing. And like I said, we are not in any sort of capacity strongly attempting to generate this type of threat. It's just there. The ongoing decline of the United States across the board is directly proportional to the rise in racial demographic change. Black racism, again, sort of the second P, and extremism has been mainstreamed as something to be celebrated and regarded generally as something noble and good. Scott Adams is right. I'm not going to go into who Scott Adams is. I'm sure some of you are familiar. Dilbert, so on and so forth. Dilbert. And yes, this. Getting ready for civil war. Okay. So the important thing that I'm identifying consistently over a span of years, one of the cases that I have, that I emphasize with students today, from a previously published article that I have with a series of fantastic co-authors, is that one of the studies that we conducted, unbeknownst to us, came before the Buffalo shooting. That was an initial moment of a sort of heightening of ideas of the Great Replacement, sort of ideas, or sort of conceptions as they existed out there within the public. And yet, we found the same relationship, which is activating ideas about racial demographic change. And to back up, I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but this is one of the cases and examples where we find this is I'm not going to read all this for you, but basically the bottom x-axis is party identification, strong Democrat to strong Republican, and the bold line within the middle is those who were primed and their support for political violence. And we're seeing a specific sort of uptick among Republicans and their support for violence, and then a decrease among Democrats. That study that I just showed you was the one that came before the Buffalo shooting, meaning these ideas were, we can infer, still strongly out there even prior to the kind of establishment and then spreading of this idea more widely of the Great Replacement. What I'm describing here very consistently is the existence of extremism without extremists. These ideas are widely held, and I'm eliciting these general reactions among the public with just a simple question or set of questions. The really, really important component of this, as it relates to the future of democracy within this country, is that it deeply calls into question citizens' democratic commitments. What do I mean by that? I'm down to elaborate more consistently, give far more context to this, but basically, the way in which I'm conceptualizing this right now and looking toward it into the future is the extent to which, historically, or in this moment, there has been a set of democratic commitments that have been maintained over time, or if in fact we are in this sort of moment wherein they're being pushed out of this national perceived idea of racial demographic change and the effect of it on one of the major parties. So the idea here is calling into question this last component. How long have these ideas existed? Now, I don't have a direct answer to how long they've existed, but I can give you, and I'm going to give you right now, a little bit more of a kind of recount of them existing far back, or far back I guess is relative, but far back beyond, or looking backward, outside of the context of this current moment within American politics. Okay, so we're going back to 08. We're taking a step back. The days that preceded Obama's victory within the 08 election. Leading up, there was some concern of there being backlash to some degree, and the way in which I recount it within this book and the next is pretty massively, pretty widely. There was a widespread widespread elation within media coverage, within sort of political discussion. And what these elided, these particular sentiments, unbeknownst to them, was a bubbling undercurrent of backlash that was emerging at this exact same point in time. What do I mean by that? What is an example of this? Right here. The immediate day after Obama's win, the white supremacist website, Stormfront, crashes, among many others, many other far-right websites, because of massive increases in traffic. I can elaborate on this further because there's a lot to say as it relates to the internet history. But this is immediately what happens. You can, please feel free, Google this, check me on this, this is totally fine. This is a comment from the website. I took this directly from Stormfront. Well, the site has crashed, and now you have to log in, so it must have brought many, many viewers in new. I agree. This will be a huge wake-up call for many whites in the US that are no longer represented. You check the date? November 5th, 2008. November 6th. Thank you, Mr. Obama. In the first 24 hours after Obama's election, Mr. Black, this is not describing Obama. This is talking about the white supremacist owner of Stormfront. Mr. Black has expanded the capacity of his server. 75,000 visitors stopped by beside the regular visitors. Other white nationalist sites on the internet are reporting similar results. We congratulate Mr. Black for the brilliant idea of hiring Mr. Obama as Stormfront's new sales manager in America. These sentiments, as I just mentioned, not only did not go away, but were missed within these initial days of, and the really important thing, and this is what relates to sort of causal identification, attributing ideas to the presidency of Obama. Just bear in mind, at this point, Obama is not known in office in any sort of capacity. He is just elected. And then, sorry, this is the third one, but you might recognize a similar sentiment here, and this is why I included it. He's not my commander-in-chief, he's dictator Obama. I'm not really sure what to do yet. We have until January 20th to plan. I don't know if that sounds familiar to you. It does to me, just a little bit. Calling into question the efficacy of the election. I'm talking about January 6th. I'm sorry, y'all, I didn't want to bury the lead. It's not a joke, okay. But yes, this sentiment, these ideas of contesting the idea of the future of this country immediately sort of swarmed in light of Obama. So this is a mass level reaction to Obama from the onset. It's an indicator of the big flip and the future of this country that many did not recognize or take seriously until we basically saw it within the reaction, as a reaction, in variant forms. One place that it initially started is the Tea Party, the sort of emergence of the Tea Party, but it didn't necessarily coalesce there. It then sort of fueled ideas, sort of reactionary sentiment, that then fueled or led to sort of Trumpian ideas. And eventually, as I'll cite Rachel Bloom, her most recent book, How the Tea Party Captured the GOP, eventually sort of took root in a large capacity within the party. It's not entirely attributable, but this is an easy case to be made about these ideas, this sort of sentiment, this backlash being deeply embedded across American society. I'm also calling to last week's conversation about post-Reconstruction, post-civil rights. We see these consistent waves of backlash. Backlash, as a concept, as something that is out there, palpable, is powerful and not at all limited to one political elite. It's not limited to one individual. It can be housed within ideology, but again, it only functions out of the sort of utility of that ideology. With a political system that is perceived as containing more people of color, more women of color, more women, even if numbers do not directly lend themselves to an uptick in a substantive, empirically verifiable way, in descriptive representation. As I am consistently showing, the threat and erosion are still there. Now I want to end this talk right here. This was missed within the early years of Obama's first victory. If you search ideas of post-racial America, of a post-racial presidency, just the mere idea of post-racial, you will find thousands of books and articles on the particular consideration that Obama's 2008 victory was a watershed moment within the function of race, or lack thereof, within American society. But the backlash, as I'm showing here, was still there. It just was not being taken seriously. So I want all of you to bear this in mind with the potential of a Kamala Harris win in a little over a month. The election results will likely be razor thin, and even if this does happen, even if Harris is to win, this could lead to further questioning of the legitimacy and efficacy of the system of democracy in America. But even absent that, there will be even more likely a backlash, the likes of which we have not seen, for a set of reasons that I can elaborate on a little bit later. For all of the historic nature and precedent of this current moment that we exist within, let us absolutely take seriously the strong potential of this backlash for the sake of ourselves, our neighbors, and the future of American democracy. Thank you. I just want to welcome Karen up on the stage with me. I'm sorry. Where do you want? Doesn't matter. Okay. I'll just take the far side.
Am I on? Good? Can you hear me? Hi. Well, my name is Karen Sweeting. I am an assistant professor with Poli-Sci, but I am also a public administrator, and I teach in the public administration program. So Andrew and I are sort of going to just have Q&A. We're just going to chat about his talk. We're going to talk a little bit about race and democratic backsliding. And the first question I want to ask, I've prepared questions to sort of keep me on task, but the first question I have to ask you is, can you elaborate a little bit more for us on this idea of the big flip, right? And what is its relation as you perceive it in terms of democracy and this idea of democratic backsliding?
Yeah, for sure. Okay. So I'm going to take it back a little bit again historically. There's a lot of conversation historically about the United States being a sort of multiracial democracy. You hear this in the conversation of, like, in the early 20th century, the great melting pot, ideas of the great American experiment, like all of these ideas in variant sort of capacities call to the sort of breadth on a particularly racial level of this democracy relative to other like European, other Western democracies, things of that sort. And there were initial questions sort of leading into like the end of the 20th century about like how the country was to grapple with changes, and people were floating ideas. Like one place of this, a little bit, is Arthur Schlesinger. His book in 1996, I believe. He calls a little bit to the sort of like multiracial component function of the United States. The major thing historically when thinking about this sort of idea of the big flip is bubbling at this point, but it doesn't yet emerge until the 2010 census. And so within the 2010 census, specifically, what is identified and projected that like demographers, if there's any demographers in the room, I'm just shout out to you. I know that you've been just, maybe I can't speak for you, but many of them have been angry about this for the longest time in the way that the 2010 census sort of led to ideas of this future, the future of this country. There was a projection within this 2010 census that by 2045, that whites would be the numerical minority. There would be a switch, a flip, majority-minority flip, and people of color would become, en masse, collectively, the majority group relative to whites. This had nothing at the moment, at that immediate moment, to do with inferences, ideas of politics. There's a great, I also want to just shout out a series of authors that have previously shown this at an earlier moment. Maureen Craig and Jennifer Richardson point out that the sort of ideas, projections of this majority-minority flip, when activated within the minds of white Americans, even at that point, at that point in time. So they end up fielding a series of studies within 2012, 2013, 2014. They show that it elicits a sense of racial threat, sort of in the same way that I'm articulating here. And that it moves attitudes in sort of distinct ways along the lines of like, in somewhat of a conservative policy direction, things of that sort. They don't measure for support for democracy at this moment. And that's ultimately what I'm intervening on. And the major thing behind this, and thinking about the big flip, is that there is nothing immediately political or that has immediate political relevance about what it is until people, folks, have engaged with the kind of like additional sets of inferences about what is to come. And the major reason why there is nothing immediately political about it, I'll give you a ton of examples. Political parties in the United States have changed over the past century. Like if we just call back to, I know this was discussed a little bit last week, but just immediately following the civil rights movement, there was a mass level of defection because of a decision or set of decisions that were made by party elites in the Democratic Party in signing the Civil and Voting Rights Acts that then led to mass level defection of Dixiecrats who were once affiliated with the Democratic Party into the Republican Party. This is obviously maintained to some degree from that moment onward, but that's just one example of the ways in which parties themselves can adapt and also just immediately change in light of like a series of unpredictable ideas into the future. Another very clear-cut moment, and I call to this within the book, some of you may recall this, within, so immediately after Obama's re-election victory within 2012, something else comes up, and that's the GOP 2012 autopsy, wherein party elites are describing the need for the party to adapt its brand or its sort of sentiment among a different set of the electorate because they perceived, as the country was changing, and that they thought Obama was a sort of canary in the coal mine moment for this, they needed to appeal to a different set of the electorate because they otherwise were going to consistently lose. So the major point here is that like this idea of demographic determinism, being on a path, there's nothing deterministic about the actual big flip, or even if there is to be a big flip, because there are a series of other decisions that folks are making. And I mean, none of us in any capacity are locked in to a sense of political identity, a sense of ideology, in any capacity.
Aren't we locked in though? Okay, so essentially the big flip focuses on this idea, and based on the US Census data, this is not expected to occur for what, another 15 to 20 years when the demographics actually are projected.
Demographers are pushing back on this very idea way more now. Like they don't even engage in a lot of this discussion.
Okay.
Partly because of how politically charged it is.
Okay, so in light of that though, how do you think historically, how connected or disconnected, I'm going to pause for a second before I finish the question. When we talk about issues of race, right, and we really sit down to have a authentic discussion about how race impacts so many factors in our day-to-day lives, people get nervous and people get uncomfortable, and it's for a number of reasons, right? So do you think that we over-project how people really engage issues of race in terms of democracy and in terms of just day-to-day reality?
So just so that I'm clear on this, letting a sort of racialized interpretation, and let's just stick here particularly to politics, a racialized interpretation of politics as people that engage in it, the criticism is that they may be over-determined in how they think about politics as being directed by the role of race. Is that what you mean?
Okay, so I'm going to read the question as I wrote it. So how connected or disconnected have you found Americans to be with our system of democracy when racial issues are at play, right? The second part of that question is, do you believe we overestimate the extent to which the public understands and has embraced democratic values and ideals when we talk about issues of race?
Okay. Now
it's two parts.
No, I can check me if I miss either of the parts. Okay, so to the first question, there is actually I'll start with the second question. Like as it relates to the way in which racial threat, senses of the future of the country are being molded, shifted, shaped by the mere inferences about the big flip, and who I identify it's like particularly connected to being overdetermined by like ideas, assumptions about Black Americans. I think what it suggests is, for one, there's not only like a need for more. I hate using this word because I think that people use it way too much, but like nuance regarding this discussion, more complexity as it relates to like the ideas in which we're engaging within the function of race. So what I basically mean by that is like when we're asking and talking about race within politics and its like current function, the way in which it's operating out there within the world, we cannot just engage in this kind of rote discussion of like who identifies in what particular sort of way, things of that sort. Like there needs to be an even more sort of robust engagement within the idea of how it is functioning within American politics. And to move to the second question, like the second idea here, I think it's particularly calling into question the commitment to democracy on the level of sort of inferences, racial assumptions of who is in either the driver's seat, in the position of power consistently, because the major thing, and this is often what the response is on the empirical level, okay, like South Africa had a white minority, but was a white dominant minority. And so when it comes to numerics, like when thinking simply about numerics, that doesn't lend itself to how the actual government, how the system itself is going to function. And so it's really, it doesn't, following from that, it lends even less support to this very idea that as the country is changing, there's going to be, or we even have a sense of what the future looks like, or that things are going to be altogether different from what they currently are. And I think the last thing I will say on this is that is a sort of what I floated, and I'll just elaborate a little bit more on. I floated this earlier when it came to like the contingent, like the idea of there being contingent support for the system and the function of democracy based upon the sort of expectation that you would win or that you can win, things of that sort. Like a deep element to the commitment to democracy, as many political theorists have articulated, is the idea and the comfort with being able to sort of lose and then either pick up the pieces or adjust, adapt. If in fact you are pushed or you perceive yourself to be in a position where you are like not within this numerical majority, not able to secure victory within the same way, those who are deeply committed to democracy would then adapt what their political platform is, adjust their coalition for the sake of then gaining power, gaining office. If in fact you turn away from the system because of the fact that you have difficulty with this idea and prospect that you can win into the future, it calls into question like the extent to which many across the American public have been committed to the system from the start. You see where I'm going with that?
Yes. I have a lot of questions, right? And we don't have time for all of my questions. I'm just going to try to stick to you. I'm thinking about so many things, and the question that's resonant at the forefront of my mind, that's not one of my prepared questions, but I'm going to digress. And I think it's a critical question because we're talking about race, and we have a woman of color here that's running for president. Is America really ready for a woman and a woman of color to be president?
I mean, I'm not gonna, well, what do you mean by ready? No, I'm serious. I mean, this is like a really, really important question. Like, ready in the way that like the backlash is not going to like completely take over in the way of it deeply contesting her role, or like, are we talking about ready in the way of how that may shift norms?
However you interpret it.
Oh. I mean, I'm not going to affirm what I think the country is ready or not ready. I think that when it comes to like the sort of expectation of what is to come, that ready would need to look, as I was calling for at the end, ready for, if we are describing, and I'm like, this is taking the teeth out of it, and I'm a little hesitant of articulating it in the same sort of way, but like if backlash is a form of growing pains in the way of the country changing or our politics changing, then yeah, ready for growing pains within that particular sort of respect. Does that assuage any of the sort of concerns that I have on the level of like how much that backlash may be, how it may be significantly more gendered within the way of like not only reacting to a woman of color within office, but women en masse? Mm-hmm. No, it does not assuage any of those concerns. But does that mean altogether that it ought not happen? I think that's kind of the reason why I struggled with the initial answer. And that is not what I am saying.
No. We're good.
Okay.
So the other question I have here that's sort of tied to this and really gets to the heart of what you talk about is this idea of this phantom threat.
Yeah.
Right? You discuss how backlash is often driven by this perceived but misguided sense of racial threat. We see, and we see it in our day-to-day, when this threat is proven to be false, yeah. People still tend to hold on to their perceptions based on these biases that they may have or fears that they may have. Mm-hmm. How has this impacted, do you believe, and continues to impact our democracy?
Yeah, this is a fantastic question. And I feel like I'm already kind of giving a lot of the professorial vibes up here, so I apologize. I'm really trying to, break. I don't want, but I'm about to get even more professorial. I apologize. For those of you in the audience who didn't, I don't know, I guess, but you wanted to come to a talk given by a professor and not see professorial, whatever. Okay. Threat in and of itself is emerging and emerges out of like a sense of anxiety, uncertainty, fears about the future that we would articulate as deeply irrational, right? Are you following? Like that's the beginning place. When it comes to those ideas, even if they are, and I am articulating and showing consistently that they are connected to a turning away from the system of democracy, if the foundational component of those sets of attitudes is deeply irrational, then responding by saying, these things aren't happening and you ought not to feel this anxious, fearful, concerned about the future when you are in fact engaging in those ideas is not at all going to assuage the sense of threat. Do you see where I'm going with this? So what I'm basically saying here is like, what I've given you right now is in a really compressed format, a sense of the logic of how these things are functioning, the sort of like the emergent components, giving a story of how they then connect, coalesce together within that sense of demographic determinism, and how they're then like sort of shifting, molding, eroding senses of support for democracy by and large. That does not mean that a simple response of, we don't know how the future of the country is to look, or there's deep uncertainty about the thing that you are expressing fear over, is going to change hearts and minds in sort of robust ways across the mass public. And then on top of this, I haven't even really included an excessive amount of elite messaging about these particular things for the sake of turning Americans out, meaning like turning them out to the polls, about convincing them. There is a, well, I mean, there's a popularized sort of version of this messaging strategy that many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with in earlier iterations of this country, Southern strategy, which is generating, eliciting through more implicit means, implicit messaging from elites, ideas of sort of racial threat to drive people, particularly either to the polls, like I said, or to convince them. In this case, like in the early 1970s, it was to defect or leave the Democratic Party for the Republican Party. Nixon engaged in a lot of this. He's the one that sort of popularized it. But the major component of what I'm describing here is like, there are two forces at work, one that may be on an elite messaging framework, and then on the other, just a deep fear and sense of like the world changing underneath your feet, that the reassurance that we don't actually know how the future is to look is not at all going to, and it doesn't. And let me actually add, it not only may not, I've confirmed that it doesn't, because when you introduce these ideas of uncertainty, what I have consistently found with large like probability samples of the American public is that among those who are the most threatened, activating these ideas and then reassuring on the level of like uncertainty, whatever, things of that sort, it ends up just leading people to deepen their both racially threatened sentiments as well as their sort of anti-democratic ones. And basically what I'm describing here is I'm not going to prescribe any sort of tool for solving this immediately. But what I am saying is that if your hunch is to respond in kind by saying, no, those things aren't happening, you ought not be worried, what you're hearing, seeing, TikTok, Facebook, social media, mass media, whatever else, is not actually happening, it does not only little to then assuage those concerns, but sometimes it can activate and inflame them even further.
Okay.
That's not rosy. I'm sorry.
No, but it leads to another question that I have for you, and we are a little bit over a month away from a major election, right? Yeah. The presidential election. And there are narratives that we are exposed to daily that has saturated the political landscape in terms of racial issues, right? We see DEI under attack. We see all of these theories from critical race theory, sexuality, gender, all of these theories are under attack, right? And people, it's shaping how people perceive rights, and it's going to influence how people show up and vote at the polls. So in terms of thinking about our current reality, right? What message or what can you convey based on the research that you've done in terms of what do we need to know as we prepare to vote for the next president of the United States, thinking about all of these issues, all of these threats. Some of them may be real, some of them may be phantom-oriented, but how do we reconcile these differences so we can utilize the systems in place to exercise our right and our vote at the what is it? What, a month and what? Today's the first, so a month and 3 days.
Yeah. The really, really crucial and important aspect of this that I think I want to emphasize and then sort of re-emphasize is there is a really crucial component to all of this that is very simple, but is often undervalued, underplayed, and it's, as it relates to, as an outcome, anti-democratic posturing, sort of like, not only in the way of influence by elites, but like the ways in which certain, like particular either citizens are activating these sort of like sentiments in the form of behavior, simply, and it's not simple because it has to be done very, very consistently, but simply reminding yourselves, the people around you, that this is not normal and not how things ought to function, puts a check in a very deep way on that behavior, those sort of sentiments, in such a way where it does not allow us to become more numb. And I describe this within the context of the book. I think the really important aspect of the extremism without extremists component of all of this is that, and I mean, Ziblatt refers to this. Ziblatt and Levitsky, within the book, How Democracies Die, refer to this very specifically. And I just retweak the kind of analogy because I'm trying to write a book too. No, I'm kidding. I think neither analogy is better. Neither analogy is better. I'm trying to be democratic. So they describe it as like a slow trickle of erosion, where like you just consistently drop water droplets onto a rock, and eventually it either cracks, things fall apart. What I describe it as is a kind of moving of the needle, which is thinking about the kind of way in which what is deemed and set as the norm of how we ought to operate within politics is a collective sort of endeavor and engagement. So basically what I'm saying here is that when it comes to there have been previous assassination attempts on other presidential candidates. They've been successful, obviously, like with JFK. There were a smattering of them during the Obama years. The growing numb or the deeming these sort of moments, and I'm using this as an example, the assassination attempts in the form of political violence, deeming those as viable when it comes to how we ought to operate within politics, or really just not engaging in further identification that this is not how we ought to operate, and this is chiefly, immediately, sort of monumentally anti-democratic. By not doing that, there is a kind of legitimizing of the actions themselves. And so collectively, like I said, the public can operate as an important bulwark and check on how others are operating, as others in the context of Americans, by and large, the mass public, as well as elites, to deem what is and what is not viable. And if that doesn't happen, and this is what I describe with moving the needle, that over time will set a new norm of what is and what isn't viable, such that it allows it opens up there being a kind of potential possibility of others engaging in similar, if not more extreme behavior with impunity, with the sort of idea that they their feet will not be held to the fire in ways that they would have been within sort of earlier moments.
And so we see that now, right?
We see that now, yeah. And so the other thing too, and this is a really crucial component to all of this, is that democratic erosion, insofar as you exist within a democracy and you are just like a person there in that space, not even just the longer that you let it go on, it will eventually find you in one capacity or another. So what I'm saying is that there are others who not necessarily dig their heads within the sand and ignore, but what I'm basically saying is that there comes a moment within this sort of process wherein each and every individual in one capacity or another is negatively affected by these changes. And what I just described for you, I'll give you just a really brief example of this, but what I just described for you is causally the ways in which racial threat can motivate and drive these anti-democratic behaviors, or really particularly just attitudes as I'm focusing on. That's the kind of, I want you to think of that as like a first mover, as people who would then want to, like I said, engage, but just really en masse support these ideas. Once they engage, or that they legitimize these sort of actions by themselves or other people, if you are not, or if the political opposition to them is still operating within the set of norms and practices within the system, they potentially can either lose or they're at a kind of disadvantage. So what I'm saying is, over time, democratic erosion can beget further democratic erosion, because when we think about this in the context of a two-party system, if one party is engaging in things that are beyond the scope of what are the rules that are set, the norms that are set, that does not give the other party any incentive structure to adhere to those, insofar as they think that's going to disadvantage them within the context of democratic elections, or elections just in general. So what I'm basically saying is, if somebody's to engage in political violence and it's successful in whatever capacity that they view themselves to be engaging in it, that opens the door for, in a response, the same but probably worse engagement within that same or worse form of political violence, which then, as you can probably imagine, at some point spirals out of control.
Okay. So, my final question. As people get ready to leave here tonight and they start ruminating on your talk, the question I have for you is, you cite Hooker in stating that race, more than any other demographic characteristic, determines who wins and who loses in American democracy. So, I'm asking you to expand on this idea for us. And the other thing I'd like for you to tell us is, what are some of the implications for the upcoming election, and what do people need to know as they get ready to leave here tonight?
Yeah, I'm gonna try in the second component of this to.
I like multiple part
questions.
Yeah.
No, it's totally fine. I just want to make sure I'm getting all of them. I'll try to conceptualize a kind of lead off, a send off. The major component that I think is deeply important for the story of the big flip, that immediately, or kind of on its face, seems quite irrational, or just something that does not make immediate sense as it relates to where, in fact, the threat across the mass public is coming from. The easy story that I have in response to that is that the big flip, for all, the major component of the sort of majority-minority flip is that when even looking at mere projections, or the actual ideas of racial groups increasing in size, Latinx Americans, Asian Americans are projected to be the groups, in respectively, one growing to become the largest among people of color, and the other the fastest growing. Black Americans are effectively stable, have not really increased in size, and if anything, socioeconomically, since COVID, things have gotten worse for the black community. It's just stable across the board. But despite those sort of empirical realities, there is a deep sense of threat from black Americans particularly, and the question that follows is why? Where and why is it coming from? This is, as I articulate, a kind of historical, it is deeply historically embedded, and the key sort of irony behind it is that it is still and yet a kind of echo from the initial structure, racial structure of this country, and the deep sense of not irreconcilable, but the lack of reconciliation that has gone on with addressing what is described as the original sin of the United States as it relates to like the function of chattel slavery, but really the kind of establishment of a permanent underclass, particularly of like viewing and operating, and just discriminating, keeping down the idea, the liberty of Black Americans particularly, and yet, so despite all of what I described as it related to the big flip, Black Americans, even while not increasing in size, are still deeply important and central to this story of the country changing. And so what that suggests to me is that despite these future sort of projections and changes, there has not been a, like I said, more immediate, long-term reconciliation or grappling with the role and function, particularly of how race was established, has been established, and is established within this country. And in a forward-moving direction, looking toward the future, that is one of the particular sorts of places, consistently, obviously through discourse, but through policy change, through ways of like addressing deep inequities across American society, that there may be, at the very least, like glimmers of hope for the future of multiracial democracy. But those things are not going to come to fruition until we are, on a complex level, but also in a very overt way, serious with ourselves and with others, those who are within our community, about what the particular sort of problem is. And one of the places, as I mentioned, is being very privy, being very aware of the potential backlash that can emerge in light of these, and then also identifying even further that although this backlash may be existing and may erode among certain people their senses of democracy, that collectively, as a public, as a set of citizens who are committed to these ideas of democracy, that we do not waver in the face of those things.
So bottom line, go out and vote and exercise your right?
Yes.
No.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think we're on time.
I think we are. Thank you so much for staying with us this evening. We've gone a little bit over time, so we're not going to have time to have questions today. A special thanks to Andrew Thompson and for Dr. Karen Sweeting for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you all next week for our next installment in the series. Thank you.